Hello, this is Ariadne Rainbird, and today I'm talking about Isidorus and his hymns to Isis with a recitation of hymn number 1. 4 hymns were inscribed to Isis on the southernmost gate of the temple to Thermouthis and Isis in Thermouthis, which is in modern Medinet Madi, a small town in the Fayum region of Egypt. These hymns were written in Greek during the Hellenistic or Greco-Egyptian period, a time of syncretism of religions where the worship of Isis had become very popular, and Isis had taken on the characteristics of a number of other goddesses and was seen as having universality and benevolent power. The hymns were written by Isidorus in the early 1st century BCE. And we know very little about Isidorus himself, other than what he has inscribed on the hymns themselves. He writes in Greek, but came from the multi-ethnic, multilingual Ptolemaic Egyptian countryside. And in his hymns, he consciously mediates between differing literary traditions and religious traditions. He uses different poetical forms and styles. In 3 of his 4 hymns, Isidorus follows a well-established hymnic convention by addressing the goddess in the second person. Whereas in the 4th hymn, he no longer addresses the goddess, but celebrates the founder of the temple at Thermouthis. The inscriptions were placed at the gates of the temple and arranged in such a way so that they flowed through them from the outside to within. And from this liminal position, Isidorus engaged with the widespread universalizing syncretic traditions, but also with the local traditions of the local Egyptian temple, a temple that was built deep in the pharaonic past, but that was now within a Ptolemaic present. Isidorus was a man with an acute awareness of the multiple and, at times, conflicting frames of interpretation of one syncretic goddess. On occasion, the hymns refer directly to where the temple is, to its location in the Arsinoe nome of Ptolemaic Egypt. The co-presence of the reader is also assumed, with the written texts representing the discourse fixed in the particular place to which they refer, i.e. the temple. A person entering the temple could directly comprehend the hymns to Isis, and moving through the temple, they would have to shift position slightly as they moved from one hymn to another, whilst oriented by the hymns to the physical space of the temple and to its divine inhabitants. The hymns were inscribed on the pillars of a gateway to the southernmost forecourt of the temple of Thermouthis and Isis. The innermost part of the temple was built 1,800 years earlier, under Amenemhat III and Amenemhat IV of the 12th dynasty. The original temple was oriented on an axis that ran south-southeast to north-northwest, so that the entrance to the sanctuary would be approached from the south-southeast. There are hieroglyphic inscriptions and images on the temple which indicate that it was originally dedicated to Renenutet, a goddess of the harvest, birth and good fortune. And she shared the temple with her consort Sobek, the crocodile god, who was associated with the Nile and with fertility. In the later Ptolemaic period, Renenutet usually was called Thermouthis in Greek texts, or Thermouthis, and Sobek became Suchios, or other variant forms of his name. At this particular temple, Sobek appeared under the Greek name Sokonopis. This early 12th dynasty temple underwent a lot of expansion and restoration during the Ptolemaic period. A number of forecourts, gates and vestibules were built on, extending around 75 metres beyond the outer hypostyle hall of the temple. Isidorus' hymns were inscribed on the gates to the outermost vestibule in this series of preliminary spaces. There was a processional way which was flanked by sphinxes and aligned with the central axis of the temple. This then proceeded from the outer gates towards the south-southeast. Towards the north, or the back of the early dynasty sanctuary, what's called a contra-temple, dedicated to the goddess Isis, was also added in the Ptolemaic period. A contra-temple, which is a tradition which dated back to the New Kingdom in Egypt, was a shrine erected close to the sacred images located in the inner sanctuary, usually at the back of the temple. And these were generally intended for the religious use of people who were not priests, who would not generally be permitted to enter the temple proper. Monumental pylons, forecourts and processional ways had long provided points of partial or peripheral access to the temple for the wider population. And these spatial and architectural practices also continued into the Ptolemaic period. The gate of the vestibule at which Isidorus inscribed his hymns was part of an intermediate zone between the outside world and the ancient religious traditions within. The central axis of the temple complex, with its series of portals, set the scene for Isidorus' hymns. But the hymns were also arranged on the posts of the gate in a manner which has been described as oddly asymmetrical. There were 2 hymns on each post of the gate, but the pairs of hymns were arranged differently. Hymn 1 was on the south side of the western pier of the gate, and a person approaching the outer vestibule of the temple complex would find it on the left pier directly facing them. Hymn 2 was adjacent to hymn 1, but on the inside or eastern surface of the same pier. Hymn 3 was on the opposite pier of the gate, also on the inside of the western surface. So, as well as dividing the hymns by pilasters, hymns 2 and 3 formed a pair that faced each other on either side of the entry to the vestibule. Hymn 4 was on the north side of the eastern pier, facing inwards towards the vestibule and the temple. The hymns were also arranged according to their poetical characteristics. So each pillar bore one hymn in dactylic hexameters and another in elegiac couplets. Hymns 1 and 3 were in hexameters, which was typical convention for Greek hymns that went at least as far back as the earliest Homeric hymns. Both of these hymns are 36 verses long and followed by a brief prose subscription, which simply says, Isidorus wrote this. Hymns 2 and 4, though, are in elegiac couplets, which was a much more unusual verse form for hymnic compositions. Though the Alexandrian poet Callimachus used this same metre in some of his hymns. So, like Callimachus, Isidorus revived the archaic practice of arranging the verses into 5 couplet stanzas. Hymn 2 consists of 3 stanzas, and like the other hymns, is followed by a simple inscription identifying the author. But this hymn is unique in having an additional inscription, which includes an elegiac couplet in which Isidorus records the blessings he has received from the gods who have heard his hymns and prayers. Hymn 4 is the longest of the hymns and has 4 stanzas, which is 40 lines long, and is also followed by Isidorus' usual signature. The one thing that permeates the hymns is the author, Isidorus himself. Little is known about Isidorus, but his name is Greek, meaning gift of Isis, with Isis itself being the Greek form of the Egyptian name Aset or Ast. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he was of Greek birth. And some scholars have suggested that Isidorus may have been Egyptian, just an Egyptian who had learned Greek during, or maybe even spoke Greek as a first language during the Ptolemaic period. And it has been suggested that he may even have been an Egyptian priest. But all we can really glean from his hymns and the inscriptions that he's made is that he was devoted to the divinities of the temple, particularly Isis, and that he believed that they had granted him blessings in return for his prayers and hymns. At the end of the fourth hymn, Isidorus tells us that he has investigated the history of the temple and its founder, and that he's translated his findings for the Greeks and to have set them up as inscriptions. So Isidorus identified himself as an intermediary between the traditions of ancient Egypt and the Greeks, translating things into Greek for the Greeks. But it doesn't tell us whether he himself spoke Egyptian or Greek as a first language, or which he was most comfortable in, or which literary tradition he was more comfortable with. In the hexametrical composition of the first hymn, which would be the first thing that any visitor would see passing through the gates of the temple's outer vestibule, Isidorus addresses Thermouthis in the second person and invokes a particular vision of this goddess through a long series of descriptive phrases that define the goddess as omnipotent and universal. He refers to her as the wealth-giving queen of the gods, Lady Thermouthis, almighty Agathatike, Isis of the great name, highest Dio, and inventor of all life. Here he explicitly assimilates the local goddess Thermouthis with the Hellenistic Isis, whose power and fame have extended far beyond Egypt at this time. This hymn is similar to a number of other aretalogical compositions in Greek that celebrate the universal power of Isis and the many names under which she was known. Isidorus addresses Thermouthis Isis as the founder of civilized life, the creator of laws and agriculture, and also as the power behind the natural fructifying rhythms of the Nile. He invokes her and continually emphasises the goddess as the object of his address, often using phrases such as "because of you" and "by your power," and describes her exalted power through simple praises concerning the heavens, the earth, and the landscape, honouring her place at the broadest level. Thermouthis Isis, therefore, is initially correlated with the entirety of the natural world. But Isidorus then narrows down the framework and connects the goddess to the Nile's annual flood, the indispensable and determinant natural phenomenon of life in Egypt. He then repeats the pattern of a universal frame that then becomes narrowed down and centred on Egypt, and with an emphasis on human geography. Isidorus lists the many different peoples who honour Isis: the Thracians and Hellenes, Syrians, Lycians, etc. He lists the various names by which Thermouthis Isis is known in these different places. And he declares then that the Egyptians call her Theuis, since she alone is all the other goddesses named by all the different nations that he has mentioned. The name Theuis is really more of a divine epithet than a proper name, and means the one, the sole, or the unique. And this was indeed an epithet of Isis in Egyptian texts. But Isidorus uses it in a slightly different way to explain a transcultural goddess or a syncretic goddess, a synthesis of a number of different divinities who have all been subsumed under the one Egyptian goddess. Though the Egyptians are referred to in the third person, like all the other nations that Isidorus mentions, they are given a greater prominence, as Isidorus demonstrates a basic competence in the Egyptian language by using the name Theuis and then explaining to the goddess why this usage is correct. And thus Isidorus affiliates himself with the Egyptians and their language and their goddess, however cosmic and international her reach might be. When we look at the spatial arrangement of references to the names of Isis amongst the different peoples that Isidorus mentions, we see that the different nations form a roughly circular itinerary, starting with the Syrians in the east, moving north and west to the Lycians, and then on to the Thracians, before turning south and west to the Greeks, and finally returning to Egypt. And thus we have made a geographical circle. Only after he has established Thermouthis Isis in a universal context, which is centred on Egypt, does Isidorus refer to himself and to his own dedication to Isis, and promises the goddess that he will never stop singing her praises. Isidorus then goes on to describe the goddess as saviour, and describes how she can save us from general categories of human suffering. Thermouthis Isis can save cities and their inhabitants from war. She saves those who are in prison, those in pain or facing death, those wandering in foreign lands or in danger at sea. Isidorus then implores the goddess to hear his prayers, be merciful to him, and to put an end to all his grief. The hymn follows a pattern which is common in ancient prayers: to give praise to the goddess, to list all her characteristics, her names, her powers. He praises her ability to save everyone from all sorts of dangers, and then asks her to apply that saving power to him. He invokes the power of a universal goddess, centred in a particular temple in Egypt, a goddess to whom Egypt is a particularly sacred land. I will now recite Isidorus's first hymn to Isis. Lady, omnipotent Agathetike, greatly renowned Isis, Dio, highest discoverer of all life, manifold miracles were your care that you might bring livelihood to mankind and morality to all. You taught customs that justice might in some measure prevail. You gave skills that men's life might be comfortable. And you discovered the blossoms that produce edible vegetation. Because of you, heaven and the whole earth have their being, and the gusts of the winds and the sun with its sweet light. By your power, the channels of Nile are filled, every one. At the harvest season and its most turbulent water is poured on the whole land, that produce may be unfailing. All mortals who live on the boundless earth, Thrace and Thracians, Greeks and barbarians, express your fair name, a name greatly honoured among all. But each speaks in his own language, in his own land. The Syrians call you Astarte, Artemis, Nanea. The Lycian tribes call you Leto, the Lady. The Thracians also name you as Mother of the Gods. And the Greeks call you Hera of the Great Throne. Aphrodite, Hestia, the Goodly, Rhea and Demeter. But the Egyptians call you Theus, because they know that you, being one, are all other goddesses invoked by the races of men. Mighty One, I shall not cease to sing your great power. Deathless Saviour, many-named mightiest Isis, saving from war cities and all their citizens, men, their wives, possessions and children, as many as are bound fast in prison, in the power of death, as many as are in pain through long, anguished, sleepless nights, all who are wanderers in a foreign land, and as many as sail on the great sea in winter, when men may be destroyed and their ships wrecked and sunk. All these are saved if they pray to you, be present to help. Hear my prayers. O One whose name has great power, prove yourself merciful to me, and free me from all distress. Isidorus wrote it.